Hello everyone, and welcome to the 149th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Vic Mackey from The Shield, one of the best TV cop dramas ever made. This series does a great job of showcasing the more human side of law enforcement, and The Shield is filled to the brim with flawed characters making flawed decisions, but no one more so than Vic Mackey. Vic and his actions paint a picture of corruption, negligence, and greed, and the story of Vic Mackey is one of tragedy, heartbreak, and unrepentant evil. Now without further ado, let's begin. Unlike many anti-heroes, the story of Vic Mackey is unique in that rather than us being exposed more and more to his evil as his story progresses, we're introduced to one of the worst things he's ever done in the very first episode of this series. And instead of his actions becoming increasingly worse as time goes on, the severity of them ebbs and flows as Vic navigates the consequences of his actions in the dangerous world he inhabits. This story is essentially the downfall of Vic Mackey from the beginning of the end to the end, and we're going to discuss how intimately important the first crime we see him committing is to how this story plays out. But first, let's get a better idea of just who Vic Mackey is. Vic has been a cop for going on 14 years at the time this story begins, and he's managed to work his way up to head of a strike team in the Farmington district of Los Angeles. A strike team is a group of officers in any given department or organization that are in place to carry out swift and decisive action to take out any enemies of that organization. In the case of a police department, those enemies happen to be criminals, and the strike team's job is to be the footmen who intercept, subdue, and eliminate the most violent criminals in the district they're assigned to. In his capacity as head of Farmington Strike Team, Vic is quite the effective police officer. He's highly intelligent, tenacious, and fearless, and his natural charisma and generally genial attitude gives him the ability to appear trustworthy and authentic to friend and foe alike. And these traits combined with his intelligence makes him an excellent manipulator and strategist. On a more personal level, Vic is gruff, loving, and loyal, and though there are plenty of people who receive his ire, like Dutch, Claudette, and Aceveda, there are even more who he holds dear to him that receive the dedication of a stalwart bulldog who will do anything in his power to protect them. Because of these traits and his years of expertise, Vic's record in the Farmington department is unmatched. Out of all the officers employed there, it's he and his team who have made the most arrests, saved the most lives, and put the most criminals behind bars. There's really no issues with his stats, as they are impressive, but there are a few issues with the kind of person Vic is. And one of those issues is his frequent usage of racial slurs. His use of racial slurs might indicate that he's truly a racist, and while I'm sure he is to some degree, I'm more inclined to believe that he uses racism to better conduct his duties in the field, as there are three distinct ways that we see Vic using racist language. The first is using racial epithets to demean criminals, gangsters, or his enemies when he's confronting them to better get under their skin, which is more of an intimidation tactic than anything. The second is related to the first, that being his use of racial slurs to refer to the rivals of the people he's dealing with, so he can establish common ground with them, which falls under the category of manipulation. The third he uses the least, however it is the greatest indicator that he might be a racist to some degree, and that's his use of slurs with his fellow officers to refer to other groups of people. But even then, he never really uses these words to demean the people he's talking about, not like say Shane, who clearly holds hate in his heart for certain races. Vic never comes off as that kind of racist, more so as a casual one. But even if that's the case, casual racism isn't something that should be praised or excused, though it does need to be said that Vic is clearly torn up whenever a person of any race is harmed because of his actions, or the actions of other criminals. And Vic isn't selective about who he helps based on their race. His use of racism in order to better do his job is more excusable, a job that has him coming in contact with gangsters and criminals who can be quite racist themselves, and again, is more of a tactic than anything. But just because your job requires you to use unsavory tactics doesn't mean you need to engage in that behavior off the clock. The next issue is Vic's misogyny, though as far as misogyny goes, Vic is rather light on that front, and there are only a handful of times that he even indicates that he looks down on women, which usually comes in the form of crude jokes. However, he is a serial adulterer during the time he's married, and the respect he has for the commitment he made to his wife, or any other woman for that matter, is minuscule at best. It should be noted as well that Vic seems to have some sort of savior complex when it comes to damsels in distress, and while his willingness to go the extra mile for troubled women is admirable in a sense, it's the way that he approaches these scenarios that typically ends up causing the person in question more harm in the long run, which is going to be a common theme with nearly everything we discuss going forward. With all these things in mind, he's definitely selfish, and he's a bit of a D-bag, but he's also selfless in many other ways, as it's clear that he's willing to run through glass barefoot for both his family, his friends, and even his fellow officers officers at times. But it's not who Vic Mackey is on a personal or interpersonal level that's the real problem. It's the actions he takes in the line of duty, as well as his methods. I'm no expert on law enforcement, and I won't pretend to know what's the best course of action for any given officer or detective to take when navigating a criminal investigation. But I'm going to assume that more often than not, becoming a criminal, in order to fight criminals, is as frowned upon by police officers as it is by citizens. Now, if you take a small bag of drugs from an addict so you can use it to capture a drug dealer who's murdered a few people, I doubt anyone is going to bat an eye. And if you're undercover and you have to do certain unsavory things to keep your cover from being exposed, that's perfectly fine as well. Vic Mackey isn't undercover, but he does take advantage of one criminal's folly to apprehend the next, and that would be all well and good if it weren't for the fact that Vic is also using his position to not just apprehend criminals, but either take over their operations or run protection rackets for them. At one point, Aceveda says that Vic is Al Capone with a badge, and while he was never that brutal, nor as successful, that label isn't too far off from the truth. Regardless, Vic is still quite proficient at being a criminal, and aside from all the crimes he commits that stem from his murder of Terry Crowley or the robbery of the Armenian money train, which we can count among his two greatest sins, there are plenty of things that he does that are morally bankrupt, or at least misguided. Some of his lesser crimes consist of the drug deals he makes, the violence he uses against suspects, aiding and abetting people like Gilroy, and the blackmail he levels at any person who poses a threat to his career, his ambitions, or his loved ones. Depending on your stance on the subject, a police officer taking a little extra on the side might not be that big of a deal, so long as they aren't hurting anyone in the process. Gaining a C note here and there from any number of activities an officer is involved in shouldn't be encouraged, but on the list of things that an officer can do wrong, taking some action on the side is relatively low on the totem pole, depending on the action, of course. For example, if you slip some money from a bust into your pocket, that's relatively inoffensive, but if you're like Vic and you're out there dealing drugs or providing dealers with drugs who then go on to cause more violence and strife in their respective neighborhoods, that's not so forgivable. Vic's use of violence to apprehend or interrogate criminals also seems rather forgivable on the surface. The best example of how effective violence can be during an interrogation is given to us during the first episode when Vic beats Grady in order to get information about the location of Jenny Reborg out of him. This man was stonewalling every detective that spoke with him, and unless they were able to establish any sort of suspicion regarding his actions, they would have had to release him from custody, and Jenny could have potentially lost her life. To prevent that, Aceveda has Vic beat a confession out of Grady, and because he was allowed to do so, Jenny was saved from the peril she was in. Now, not many people would feel bad for Grady, as all that Vic did was give a beating to an abusive and abhorrent man who more than deserved to feel Vic's knuckles cracking against the side of his head. However, it's not always this straightforward, as Vic is dealing with suspects, and they're just that, people you suspect of committing a crime, but haven't actually confirmed whether they have or not. Violence is an easy and effective way to confirm those suspicions, but what happens when you're wrong? Well, your good intentions result in the bodily harm of another person, and even if you're right 80% of the time, the 20% of the time that you aren't makes this practice shoddy at best. As though violence might lead to a swift conclusion of any given criminal endeavor, it isn't the only solution to your problem. And while in the case of people like Grady many options had already been exhausted, and extreme measures seem necessary, more often than not, there are alternate solutions to any perceivable dead end you've reached, and using those alternate solutions prevents harming people who might be innocent. Furthermore, when the brutality you inflict on someone leads to other people getting hurt, like say Ronnie, who had his face held to a burner because Vic did the same to Armadillo, that brutality becomes harder to justify, as not only are you potentially harming a suspect who might be innocent, but the unintended consequences of your use of violence to enforce the law are near limitless, and it's for these reasons that it's often the better course of action to treat people like people, regardless of the alleged crimes they've committed. There's another subset of his violent actions as well, that being the brutalization of people he's confirmed to be criminals in order to punish them. An example of this is when he's hunting a man named Ruiz, who assaulted 5 women earlier that day. When Vic and his fellow officers find Ruiz, they sick a canine on him to coax him out of his hiding spot and surrender his weapon. When Ronnie shows up and declares that the man doesn't have his gun, Vic, as well as the other men present, choose to let the dog maul him for several seconds before Vic has him called back. Now, is this really a problem? Yes and no. The concept of innocent until proven guilty isn't perfect, but it is the most surefire way to ensure someone gets the punishment they deserve. And even if you're 99.9% sure that someone has committed a crime, it's probably best to let the system play out, even if the system doesn't work 100% of the time. However, if you are 99.9% sure, and you do choose to take action like this, I don't think anyone really cares all too much. And if Vic verified that a man assaulted several women in a single day and allowed him to get mauled by a dog for a few seconds, well, I'm willing to turn a blind eye to that and anything similar to this crime. Moving on, Vic's blackmailing of his opponents is another example of his dirty practices. Some of it's more excusable, like Vic's leverage over Aceveda, who gets his own hands dirty on numerous occasions. But when it comes to people like Julian and Detective Kavanaugh, two people that Vic blackmailed into oblivion so he could save his job when they had every right to pursue his loss of it, is wrong and isn't something that should be condoned. So these are the lighter crimes that Vic routinely engages in, and some of them have a more medium weight to them, but it's time that we get into some of the heavier stuff. And an example of the more heinous misguided actions he takes lies within his willingness to keep certain unstable confidential informants, or CIs, on the streets. In the first episode of the show, we see that Vic keeps a man named Lonnie Reborg as his informant, a drug addict who he plies with drugs and money to keep him on his side so he can provide him information. In theory, this is a fine thing to do, as many informants are allowed to keep conducting illegal activities in order to get closer to the action. The problem we encounter with Lonnie and Vic's relationship is the fact that Lonnie isn't a CI like, say, Vanbro, who dabbles in illegal activity here and there, but is for the most part a reformed criminal trying to earn some cash by informing. No, Lonnie is highly volatile and thoroughly dependent on his drug of choice to function, and it's not so much that Lonnie is a drug addict that makes him a problem, but the fact that Vic essentially encourages him and his cohorts to keep using drugs in order to serve him better, which inadvertently affects all the people around him, as Lonnie clearly has several issues that makes him a dangerous person. This couldn't be more clear in the fact that Lonnie ends up murdering his ex-wife while high, after he took the knife she was using to defend herself because he tried to pick up their daughter from her home. And after he murdered her, he went and sold his daughter to someone for $200 so he could buy even more drugs. By all accounts, Lonnie should have been in a treatment program or even prison. But because Lonnie was someone that Vic thought he could control, two innocent people suffered for it. And if Vic wasn't only looking out for his own interests in this scenario, Lonnie's wife and daughter would have been spared death and the horror of abuse. You never really know what any given person is going to do, but this is definitely a case of Vic's better judgment becoming clouded by the prospect of either a bigger payday for himself, or the thought that keeping Lonnie on the streets would net him worse offenders than Lonnie down the line. Now to be clear, it isn't all self-interest with Vic. He's not so corrupt that he only uses his badge for his own personal gain, but it is about 50-50. Half the time he's looking out for himself, and the other half he's trying to put away criminals. And it's the mixture of the two that blinds him to the consequences of his actions, which is what happened with the Lonnie situation. To be fair, it's evident that with people like Connie, he does try to steer them in the right direction, and with Lonnie, he could have been doing the same thing, but Vic has every right to put people in the CI program rather than simply taking them on as his CIs covertly. With the CI program, informants are held accountable by drug tests and routine check-ins with the police that prevent them from spiraling back into their bad habits. But even in his relationship with Connie, there's several issues, namely the fact that just like Lonnie, she ends up murdering another person, only this time, Vic covers it up for her because he cares for her, which is wrong on so many levels. With the way Vic handles these CIs, they might get closer to the action by continuing to be so thoroughly ingrained in a criminal lifestyle, and can theoretically help him make more arrests this way, but there's always the danger of a Lonnie Reborg scenario playing out when they're left to their own devices. And this is just one example of Vic's seedy tactics, causing more harm than good in the long run. But we have many more examples of the harm Vic Mackey causes to himself and others with his actions, and most of them stem from his self-serving ways. When Vic is dealing with his victim informants, which is how I'll refer to anyone that Vic forces to pay protection money to him, several nasty things occur due to the leniency he shows them. A good example of this is when Vic trusts Rondell to keep his crew off the streets following a shootout at a nightclub. 4 people, including a child, lose their lives when Rondell doesn't follow Vic's advice and looses his dealers back onto their corners. What happens here with Rondell is one of the best examples we're given regarding what could potentially happen when Vic allows thugs like him to stay in business. Vic allows dealers he struck a deal with to continue dealing in exchange for them agreeing to keep violence on the streets to a minimum. Is a good idea in theory, as when you lock up drug dealers and gangsters, it seems like it's only a matter of time before new ones pop up to take their place. So on the surface, it appears that rather than taking links out of a chain that will eventually disintegrate, you're only perpetuating a cycle of never-ending violence and crime by restarting the process when you lock someone up. However, the reason that this happens isn't just because there's a power vacuum to be filled following incarcerations, but because of the overall climate in any given area that you remove these criminals from. If you arrest thieves, murderers, and thugs without making any efforts to improve the conditions of the neighborhoods you've taken them from afterwards, of course things are going to stay the same. In this way, Vic's solution, while being helpful in some ways, is only a band-aid that masks the problem in these low-income neighborhoods. They say it takes a village to raise a child, and if that village is riddled with poison, how can you you expect anything to improve when you do the bare minimum to improve things there? Many police departments are understaffed, and they can't always be there to ensure that everything in a neighborhood goes smoothly, and they shouldn't be expected to. After all, they're extensions of the justice system, not babysitters. It's not just the police's responsibility to stop crime in a town or city. It's the entire community's, and to a lesser extent, the government, as government programs can only go so far in meeting the needs of its people if they aren't willing to help themselves. So yes, Vic's methods help in the short term, but Vic is only prolonging the problem, not solving it. Whether it's the 1-9ers, the Bizlats, the Armenians, or anyone else, Vic's willingness to entertain their murderous practices is a slow poison that has potentially doomed just as many lives as it has saved. And considering Vic isn't just letting them continue to operate so he can keep the peace or apprehend criminals, but so he can line his pockets as well, this is one of the greater evils of Vic Mackey. Another terrible thing to consider about all the crimes that Vic is engaged in, that we've discussed so far, is that more often than not, he isn't committing them alone. Vic is the head of a team, and different members of that team are nearly always involved in these crimes to varying degrees. However, as Shane remarks in his suicide note, Vic is at the center of it all, and while Lem, Ronnie, and Shane's willingness to aid Vic in his criminal endeavors is their own decision, Vic is the one who drew them into it in the first place. Vic has quite the magnanimous personality, and it's easy to see how others can get drawn into his web either consciously or subconsciously. Intelligent, decisive, charming, and charismatic, and a man like that, whether he intends to or not, inevitably draws people to him, and in doing so, he makes it easier for them to go along with whatever unsavory actions he takes in an attempt to mimic him, achieve the same status as him, or enhance the friendship that they've developed with him. So with all we've discussed in mind so far, as well as Vic's overall personality, I think it's safe to say that Vic is a certifiable scumbag. On the surface, he might seem like a decent enough guy, but when you factor in all the self-serving crimes he commits, and the harm he causes because of those crimes, it's hard to look at him and say, well, he does love his kids. He's not so bad. But everything we've talked about so far is nothing compared to the crimes he commits, or that his team members commit, in relation to the murder of Terry Crowley and the Armenian money train heist. And it's these two things that elevate Vic from scumbag to villain. The lesser of the two crimes, the Armenian money train robbery, still has several implications surrounding it that causes harm to others who were involved or adjacent to it. The robbery itself is morally gray when you consider they were stealing from criminals. But one man did lose his life during the robbery, and afterwards when the team were trying to hide their involvement, they caused the death of another man, O'Brien, a man who took a bag of marked Armenian money off the sidewalk near a bar he frequented, and to further cover up their involvement and take the Armenian-based heat off of them, Vic murders Margos, though I don't think anyone was too upset about that one, especially after we watch him murder Sosi. And while the entire police department was after Margos, considering he killed her while Vic was attempting to take him out because of his robbery, this can be seen as yet another consequence of that crime. Another unfortunate occurrence that came as a result of this robbery was Aceveda's assault by Juan Lozano. Aceveda was following a trail that led to some of the marked money from the robbery, and while it was his fault for staying at a potentially dangerous crime scene on his own, he wouldn't have been there in the first place if Vic and his team hadn't staged this robbery, and therefore he wouldn't have had to experience the horror that is being assaulted in that way. Yet another instance of a single crime being responsible for the suffering of so many others. All the horrid things that happened after the money train robbery are nothing compared to the ramifications of Vic's murder of Terry Crowley. This term wasn't originally used to describe this event, but it's been said that the bullet that Gavrilo Princip fired at Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the shot heard around the world. One decision by one man that ignited the Great War that devoured millions of lives. The shot Vic Mackey fired at Terry Crowley wasn't heard around the world, but it was the shot that signaled the destruction of Vic Mackey's world. Terry's murder was nothing more than a cold-blooded and desperate act of violence that was taken in order to save Vic and his team from losing their jobs and being prosecuted for the crimes they committed while performing those jobs. And there's absolutely zero justification to be made for taking it. Terry was an innocent man who was only trying to do his job, and while he wasn't informing on Vic solely out of the goodness of his heart, he was still well within his rights to do so, considering all the heinous things that Vic had done up to that point. There isn't much more to say about Terry's murder beyond the fact that it was wrong and unjustifiable, but there is plenty to say about the impact it had on Vic and everyone around him. It must be said that Terry's family and friends were impacted by his untimely death, and that's a significant factor in why murder is the worst crime any person can commit. But as far as Vic is concerned, nearly everything negative that happened to him or his loved ones stemmed from this moment. His divorce, the strain between him and his children, the disbanding of the strike team, his rift with Shane, and the trouble with Antoine Mitchell, Lem's murder, Detective Kavanaugh's investigation and incarceration, the murder and torture of Guardo Lima, his plan to murder Shane for Lem's death, Shane's murder-suicide, Ronnie's incarceration, all of these things stem from Terry Crowley's murder, or rather the investigation into the murder of Terry Crowley, as theoretically, if Vic had managed to cast off all suspicion from him and his team, none of these terrible things would have ever happened. The thing is though, something negative should have definitely happened to Vic and Shane for murdering Terry, as they're murderers, and no one should be able to get away with murder. Should all the people around them have suffered in the way they did? No, not necessarily, but consequences still should have arose from their actions. If Vic and Shane had been discovered by the authorities and incarcerated for this murder, a lot of the horrid things that happened to the people who were involved, or who were adjacent to them, would have never happened. Yes, Vic would have probably still lost his family, and Shane would have never had the opportunity to start his, but they both deserve that. Do Lem and Ronnie deserve their fates though? Lem didn't deserve to die, but at the time of his death, he did deserve some sort of punishment for the crimes he'd aided his fellow teammates in committing, and the same can be said for Ronnie, who by the time of his arrest, more than earned the sentence he received. However, if they hadn't been strung along by Vic and his criminal ways for so long after the murder, they would have been much better off for it. They could have still dabbled in the occasional crime here or there without Vic, and they did deserve to be punished in some way for the crimes they had already committed with him by the time Terry was murdered. But they were more than capable of turning their lives around at this point had Vic gone to prison. Now, Vic wouldn't have had to murder Terry in the first place if he hadn't been such a dirty cop. And while this act was definitely the beginning of the end for Vic, his criminal lifestyle made this ending possible. Yes, all the lesser crimes that Vic committed are just that, lesser crimes. But if all of them led him here, is there really any point in labeling them lesser, or are they just components of a larger evil? They are, and that's one of the biggest fallacies of criminal behavior. You might think you have a handle on the crimes you're committing, and that might very well be the case, but a small crime can quickly accelerate into a larger crime, and before you know it, you're knee-deep in blood when all you were trying to do was earn some extra cash or have a little fun. Now, does everything that's considered a crime deserve to be seen as such? No, definitely not. Laws aren't perfect, but the fact remains that if you break a law, whether it's just or unjust, you run the risk of breaking even more as you go deeper down the rabbit hole, or when you attempt to cover up your previous crimes when they're discovered. You know, there's actually a great way to prevent yourself and your loved ones from having to experience the pain that comes from the consequences associated with a life of crime. To not begin one in the first place. Barring desperate times, there is no real reason to run the risk of committing crimes compared to anything else, or misguided thought process related to how you need to provide for the ones you love. Vic Mackey is guilty of both. He wanted to provide more for his family than a cop's salary can provide, and he wanted to be the badass on the street taking down bad guys and running the show. You know what his family might have appreciated more than a bigger paycheck? A father and a husband present in their lives, one who wasn't out at all hours of the night, doing God knows what with God knows who. You know what his community might have appreciated? Someone who was truly working to better his community by not just locking up criminals, but by making strides to improve the areas that they had worsened with their activities, instead of letting them run rampant through the streets with his blessing. And regardless of whether or not anything Vic was doing was against the law or not, Vic is still a murderer, and murder is evil. To make matters worse, he got away with everything he did, and he did so after destroying the lives of every single person who was close to him, and many more who were around him. Corinne, his kids, Lem, Ronnie, Shane, Mara, Kavanaugh, and any of the dozens of criminals or other innocents he dealt with. All of these people suffered because of Vic's actions, and rather than being punished for all the misery he sowed, Vic Mackey is awarded a cushy seat in an office, writing out reports. A life that he doesn't exactly enjoy living, but one that's better to say, being blown up with a grenade, or spending your life behind bars. In reality though, this is his punishment, and though he isn't locked away in prison, he might as well be. Everything and everyone Vic has ever loved is gone, and he has no one to blame but himself for it, and the life he now lives is one of isolation, guilt, and regret. So when Vicky is sitting at his cubicle at the end of this series, he might not deserve to be there, but he does deserve to feel the enormous weight of all that he's done, even if most everyone who suffered to give him that feeling doesn't. So yes, even though Vic Mackey is both the hero and the villain of this story, and of his own, unfortunately for Vic and everybody else he came into contact with, it was his belief that he truly was the hero throughout all of this that led to so much pain and suffering being inflicted upon others. Part of the reason why Vic was so comfortable with doing all the terrible things he did was because he thoroughly believed that he was one of the best police officers employed by the LAPD. Take the murder of Terry Crowley, for example. It's not just that Vic wanted to keep Terry from informing on him, but that he was convinced that the streets of LA were better off with his strike team roaming them. All of his murders, brutality, drug dealing, protection rackets, blackmailing, and generally negligent policing practices were necessary evils in his eyes, as it was the long arm of Vic Mackey that in his mind was preventing all of these things from getting out of hand. At one point, Vic describes himself as an action hero, and that's a pretty good summation of the way he sees himself. He's the guy who's running through explosions, kicking ass and taking names, but he doesn't really think all too much about what happens beyond his fist connecting with someone's jaw, nor does he truly care, which is evident by the amount of remorse he shows for his actions, which is surely some, but not even close to being enough to cause him to change his nefarious ways, especially when you consider that when he was asked by Lem whether he felt bad for any of the things they had done up to that point, he answers with a very definitive no. But of course it wasn't about enforcing the law in a more effective way with Vic when he committed crimes. It was about his desire to make something more of himself, for his and his family's sake. It can't be said that Vic was totally selfish throughout all of these ordeals. No, he had some good and honorable intentions. But those intentions don't really matter all too much when you're depriving other people of their loved ones to ensure the prosperity of your own. Yes, Vic Mackey was thoroughly corrupt and bad to the bone, a misguided would-be do-gooder who spread more evil than perhaps anyone else in his department ever had. But it's not just Vic Mackey who was corrupt. Ben Gilroy ensured that anything Vic did was excused under the umbrella of strike team privilege. Aceveda, though adversarial towards Vic for a good part of this story, also employed and excused Vic's seedy tactics for his own gain. Even Captain Rawling entertained Vic's darker tendencies to get the job done. And you know what? Perhaps there is a certain amount of gray area when it comes to law enforcement, especially if you're so ingrained on the street level and are actively trying to combat gangsters and other nefarious criminals. But Vic Mackey didn't operate in a gray area. I'm sure he did when he started out, but by the time this story begins, Vic Mackey's moral position is best described as an abyss that has a few pinpricks of light scattered throughout it. Vic is a self-righteous hypocrite whose ego and selfishness makes him into a walking death trap, and if anything shows us how foolhardy and misguided he is, it's a comment he makes to Amolia during a conversation they're having about the Kavanaugh affair at the end of Season 5. Vic says to Amolia, "If you had made better choices from the beginning, none of us would be ripped up right now." If Vic thought for a second about the words that were coming out of his mouth, he'd realize that he was only talking to himself there, and that it was Vic Mackey's choices to be the criminal he is that brought him to the point where everything he loved was destroyed. And though the evil of Vic Mackey is great, it is seemingly behind him, and he has the opportunity now to make whatever amends he could possibly make with the time left to him. But whatever he does, it would probably never be enough, as someone who has caused so much death and destruction doesn't really deserve to be forgiven in the eyes of the people he's harmed. But even though Vic is capable of doing so, if he really wanted to, I doubt Vic Mackey's path is going to be one of redemption from this point on, as at the end of this series, we see him with a smile on his face and a gun in his waistband as he walks from his office to the tune of police sirens, doubtlessly going off to resume doing what he's always done, no matter how much folly is present in that path. Thank you all for tuning into this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Vic? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you liked this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, to my patrons, and to anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.